right, it's just past 6:30, so we'll call the meeting to order. The first item on the agenda is disclosures of pecuniary interest. If any member of council has a pecuniary interest with respect to any of the agenda items, you can make those declarations in writing with the clerk. Adoption of the minutes from the May 27th and June 3rd meetings. Motion reads, be it resolved that the minutes from the regular council meeting held May 27th, 2019 and the special council meeting held June 3rd, 2019 be approved and presented as circulated. Moved by Councillor Bernardo, second by Councillor Fegan. Any questions or comments on those minutes? All in favor? Motion carried. That brings us to our planning and public meeting. Tonight's public meeting under Section 34 of the Planning Act is to consider an application for zoning bylaw amendment for lands municipally known as 221 Owen Sound Street. The purpose and effect of the amendment is to rezone the property from residential type R2 zone to residential type 4 exception R4 number sign. I'll ask the clerk for the method of notice for the public meeting.
Notice of tonight's public meeting was advertised in local media sources as of May 9th, 2019. Notice has been posted on the town's website, and notice was provided to property owners within a 120-meter radius of the subject property.
We'll have a presentation from Steve Weaver, the town planner, following which there will be an opportunity for questions from members of the public and council or to provide comments. The clerk will also accept written submissions if you have those. We would ask that all submissions, whether they're written or oral, be given consideration prior to any decision being made by council. There is a sign-in sheet that we would ask any member making a comment or asking a question to sign if you wish to receive notice of council's decision or further actions on this matter. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is the second of two public meetings for this property in the recent council agenda. So the last meeting was on May 27th, and it was regarding the application for consent, which was in front of Committee of Adjustment. So given that this application was just recently presented, I will try to keep the focus of this presentation on the zoning application, which is a condition of the consent application that was conditionally approved at the May 27th meeting. So the subject property, and you do have a copy, I think, of this presentation in front of you, members of council. The first slide shows the subject property on an air photo. It's located at the southeast corner of Owen Sound Street and 2nd Ave. And currently has one single detached dwelling on the property, as well as a detached garage behind the dwelling. The dwelling faces out towards Owen Sound Street and has a side yard facing out towards 2nd Ave. There's also a municipal rear lane behind the property that provides additional access. Servicing connections are off of 2nd Ave and off of the rear lane with the sanitary sewer. So the purpose of the application is to rezone the property to two site-specific R4 zones. Currently the property is zoned R2, which permits single and semi-detached dwellings. The proposed R4 zone has similar permitted uses. It would also permit single and semi-detached dwellings. And the reason for the rezoning is that as per the severance application, which would divide this lot into two lots, one of the conditions is to rezone the property both to recognize the current use of the existing lot, the retained lot, which will continue to be used for the existing single-family home, and the other lot, which is proposed to be developed for a new single-detached dwelling to the east of the existing dwelling. So essentially, the severance, as presented on May 27th, will divide this into two lots. The first lot will remain with the existing house fronting on Owen Sound Street. The second lot would face towards 2nd Avenue, would be available for construction of a second dwelling. So the first part of the rezoning is for the retained lot, so the existing house. The existing house would be rezoned to R4-6. The purpose of that zone is to recognize that the lot area would be reduced to 366 square meters. In addition, the existing dwelling predates the current zoning bylaw, so it does not meet all the current setbacks. It is grandfathered in the zoning bylaw, but one of the purposes of the site-specific zoning would be to recognize those existing setbacks. So a minimum front yard of 1.8 meters, minimum side yard on the north side is currently 0 meters. There's actually a bit of an encroachment on the town's right-of-way, 0.15 meter over the lot line. So this would recognize that the existing dwelling is right up against the lot line, and would require that any addition to the existing house would have to meet the side yard setback of 3 meters. On the south side yard, the site-specific zone would require that there's a setback of 1.2 meters, and the last part of the rezoning proposed to that existing dwelling is the applicant is also proposing to use that existing house for up to 3 dwelling units. So currently they have the main dwelling unit, which is the original house, plus they've converted the second floor to a second unit, so there is an accessory apartment within the house. And the proposal is to allow a 3rd dwelling unit, and that's one of the reasons for the requested rezoning. On the next slide, so number 4, it shows the location of the proposed severed lot. And this property would be rezoned from R2 to R4-7. Because this lot would be smaller, the yards would be adjusted accordingly. So similar to the existing house and other houses in the area, the minimum front yard would be reduced from 6 meters to 3.8 meters. The reason that that works on this lot is that driveway access would be provided off of the side lot line, so the side yard off of the rear lane. So that side yard would really function as the rear yard and would have a minimum setback of 6 meters, both for the driveway and for some amenity space. Opposite that yard would be the other side yard, which would have a minimum setback of 1.5 meters. And then finally, the south yard would have a minimum yard of 3.6 meters. It would really function as a side yard. The next slide, number 5, on my presentation, just compares the current R4 zoning requirements versus the proposed R4 site-specific requirements for each lot. So again, the retained lot would have a reduced front yard, recognizing the existing dwelling, would have a reduced exterior side yard on the north side, recognizing the existing encroachment, and would have a increased minimum side yard on the other side of 1.2 meters. The severed lot would have a reduced front yard of 3.8 meters, again recognizing that the side yard with the garage would, or with the driveway would have 6 meters setback for parking. And then the rear yard would be 3.6 meters, which is a reduction from the normal 7.5 meters. That's illustrated graphically on the severed sketch that's attached to the presentation on slide number 6, where you can see the various setbacks both for the existing and new dwelling on each lot. So outlined in green is the proposed retained lot, which would contain the existing house. And then outlined in blue is the proposed severed lot, which would be zoned R4-7 and would have those site-specific setbacks. So the application was circulated in accordance with the Planning Act. The comments here were summarized previously for the consent application, so I won't go through each of them. There's no concerns raised in the agency circulation and no objection to the approval of the zoning bylaw. Of course, we're here for the public meeting to get comments both from council and the public on the proposed zoning amendments. Subject to those comments and any concerns that are raised, we are recommending that this be considered, including the draft bylaw, for approval. If there are any comments or concerns that require some follow-up, then the bylaw could come back to a future meeting. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Are there any questions from members of the public regarding this application? Questions from council? These changes, Steve, I mean, they're consistent with some of the changes we've made with respect to similar applications in town, you know, severing larger, older lots and then reducing some setbacks to accommodate a second dwelling.
Exactly, yeah. We've applied some standard tests to all of these applications, including this one, including that it provides parking in accordance with the bylaw with an adequate width and length of driveway, that it still provides some amenity space, even with the reduced yards, and still allows for an adequate building envelope to construct a reasonably sized dwelling, and protects neighboring properties by not encroaching too close to those lot lines. So this is very consistent with some of those other previous corner lot severances in terms of meeting those expectations.
And the newly severed lot here will also have access from the back lane as well?
Correct, yes. So there would be no driveway off of 2nd Avenue on this lot. It would all be off of the lane.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Councilor Donato?
Steve, on the proposed or separate lot, whereabouts is the driveway?
It's just to the right-hand side of the house. It's the 6-meter area that's shown. And it would be wide enough for 2 cars to park side by side.
2 cars?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, if in the winter time, if with the 3 on the current lot, the 3 proposed there, in the winter time, if they have friends, guests, party, whatever, where are they going to park? On the street?
So I have talked to the owner about that and asked that in their lease agreements, they specifically identify which of his units would have a parking space, and if that's 1 per unit, or it has to be a minimum of 1 per unit. They would have some additional space on the driveway in the boulevard. There's no sidewalk on the south side of 2nd Ave, so although that's not where the town would encourage people to park, there would be space there that wouldn't encroach on the town's snow plowing operations. It wouldn't affect any sidewalk. And that's actually where parking is provided now on the lot.
So in the lease agreement, they only allow 1 vehicle?
Correct. The tenants would each be advised in their lease agreement that they have access to 1 parking space for their unit, so that they don't come in expecting to be able to park 2 or 3 vehicles for their unit on the lot.
Okay. Hopefully that's followed through and policed, because
in the end, if there are a lot of cars parking on the street as a result of more vehicles than spaces on the site, then that does become an enforcement issue. But like any other lot that's got 1 or more units, the parking standard is 1 per unit across the town. So
1 per unit.
they are meeting that parking requirement under the zoning.
Yeah, 1 per unit for the garage.
Any further questions from council? Last chance for members of the public? No? Okay, so the recommendation reads, be it resolved, the council receives report P 2019-14 from the town planner as presented and circulated, and that subject to the consideration of any input received at the public meeting, that leave be given for the reading and enacting of bylaw number 36-2019, being a bylaw to amend zoning bylaw number 38-2007 as amended by rezoning the lands known municipally as 221 Owen Sound Street in the town of Shelburne. The mover and seconder for that motion. Moved by Councilor Donato, seconded by Councilor Buffett. Any comment? All in favor? Motion carried. Okay, thank you, Steve. All right, so that brings us to our public question period, and I'm just going to make a brief statement before we get into this. I suspect that a large number of those of you who are here from the public are here to hear the questions and answers from the consultant as follow-up from last Monday's meeting. As you probably know, the consultant will not be taking questions from the public. He will, however, be taking questions from members of council. That's the next item on the agenda. So if you have questions with respect to the consultant's report, I would ask that you hold those at this point. It's not really appropriate, I don't think, in question period to ask council to ask, or rather to answer questions on behalf of the consultant. So the hope is that if any question you may have with respect to the consultant report will likely be answered as part of the Q&A with council. So having said that, are there any other questions that members of the public have for question period? Mark?
Why are you not letting us, as the public, ask questions to the consultant?
Quite frankly, I just don't think it's appropriate at this point to put the consultant in that position. I mean, he's made a report, gave a presentation last week, sort of based on a factual analysis. The concern, I guess, would be that if we start getting into hypothetical situations, you know, it's not a fair spot to put a consultant that has been hired by the town in. So those questions, you know, again, will be asked by council in terms of factual analysis, but I don't think it's appropriate to put a hired consultant in that sort of position. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, Martin Wade, what happens if the council don't ask these questions that we would like to ask? Then what do? We leave without an answer?
Well, I guess potentially tonight you would. I do think, I mean, I've spoken to a number of members of the public. I know my colleagues have as well. I think most of the questions that I've had posed to me from members of the public are certainly questions that are in my mind as well, at least thematically, that we may not word them the exact way that you might. But I think most of the things that you have on your mind will probably be fleshed out as part of this Q&A period.
A lot of flushing, but I don't say so.
Mr. Mayor, just a question in terms of some of the process is certainly one which remains to be seen whether or not there's due diligence and transparency, but one of the past reports that you've had, and it's all part of this, is that the issue of the Fiddlefest Park or Fiddle Park lands. I need to ask the council the question about, since the town owns the Fiddlefest Park, or Fiddle Park, pardon me, which I understand council is, it is underutilized. The Shelburne Police Service would only need an acre and a half for a proper police facility. Why would this property not be considered for a new facility when you've got your consultant report here talking about it? Will you ask them the question about why it won't be considered, or will the council make that decision?
So just to be clear, your position is the council should consider using Fiddle Park for the construction of a new police station?
Yeah, why wouldn't this property not be considered for it? That's the question I'm asking council.
Okay.
And then I have another one which deals with the OPP costing, and I respect your position, though. I think I need to know whether or not, Mr. Mayor, and through your council, to ask the question as to whether the costing formulas will be guaranteed for the next 10 years. I know that you asked not to be said, and I think you have to ask those questions, and I don't think you're going to ask it unless I raise it.
Sorry, can you just rephrase that?
Would the council discuss and answer the question about the OPP costings dealing with the cost formulas remaining in place for the next 10 years? Can you tell me whether or not council will have that answer? Is it going to be confirmed, guaranteed for the next 10 years? And if you don't know, find out.
Yeah, I have no problem answering that. I can hazard a guess what the answer will be, but I have no problem asking that. Mark?
Well, can I ask that the council is done asking questions, if the public could ask the council a question that they could ask?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay, anything else for question period?
That was a no.
Mr. Mayor, I just want to know, Holly Wade, 274 Jelly Street, I just want to know if the OPP takeover, is the Special Olympics still going to be going on, or is that going to not happen at all?
The special what, sorry?
The Special Olympics?
Oh, the torch run.
Yes.
I mean, that's up to...
They've been doing it for many years, so just...
Just to be clear, I mean, the Special Olympics event is not, just a Shelburne police event. That's something that is sort of a problem. So I think that question was actually asked specifically to the OPP representatives when they were here, and I believe, and my colleagues can correct me if my recollection is incorrect, but I believe their response was that they would be more than happy to have any of their officers sort of take the lead in planning those sorts of events if that were to be what happens. Mark.
Okay, so if we're not going to have an opportunity to speak to the consultant, I would have to say
Was it downloaded as a PDF?
It was downloaded as a PDF, and the large charts were put on sideways. You couldn't even turn them to print them bigger.
Okay. Yeah, did you try printing it?
Yes, I did.
And that
And
didn't
I
help
tried
you?
zooming in on it, even the resolution wasn't good enough to hardly read the numbers when it was over on your screen.
But I'm assuming we can print a copy if there's a particular chart that you want to see. Yeah.
It should be made available so that someone could print it in a large format to actually read the document. I noticed the council was given to them in large sheets, but that should be able to.
Well, it was just on legal side paper. It was stapled the other way, and
Yeah, we've got it only 8.5 inches wide. That big chart that you've got 14 inches wide.
yeah. Okay.
And again, Martin Wade from 274 Jelly. I was a little disappointed that our town spelling was misspelled. Very disappointed. You know, it's one thing to process and give out a report, but we're proud of our town. So get the spelling right.
Understood. Okay.
I have just a question. Mr. Barrett, I'm Shardy, 141 Main. Was there in the consultant's report, maybe if you could add or ask somebody from council ask the question, if the cost, the value of a $3 million police station was considered as an asset when comparing the OPP versus the Shelburne police. I didn't see that considered in the report at all. So if that, the council could ask that question of the consultant on Republic's behalf, that would be great. Okay, thanks.
All right, so we'll close question period, and with that, I will invite Mr. Jon Hambides, I guess, to the podium there. Now, before we get into the question and answer portion, are there any comments you want to make up front, or?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, we learned today that there was an item that was left out, a costing item. It was a value of $200,000, $203,000 in addition to what we've costed. That was due to additional payouts to staff as a result of the uniform collective agreement. So we've corrected that, and overall it makes, over a 10-year period, is $203,000.
Sorry, excuse me, who? I hardly hear you.
Sorry. The payout is to the uniform staff, the police officers.
Another additional 203.
An additional, yeah.
Okay. Any additional comments, or just get right into the questions? Okay. So I think what we'll do, we might as well just start at one end of the table. I suspect that each member may have more than one question, and that's fine. But we'll start with Councillor Bernardo. We'll just work our way down through every member of council.
Yeah.
And if something else, well, we can start at the other end too. You're senior here, so I thought we'd start with you. If once we get through everybody, if something else comes to mind, by all means, feel free to ask additional follow-up questions afterwards. But we'll give everybody a shot first to go through kind of their list of questions, and then we'll sort of regroup. So, Councillor Bernardo.
So, several questions, and they keep popping in out of my mind. One of my questions, I guess, is in regards to the OPP costing. You put it at 1.5% throughout the whole increase. Am I correct in that thought process when I read it? Per year? It's about 1.5?
Which part?
The yearly increase for the OPP is about 1.5%? Right.
Sorry, you're gonna have to say that again.
The yearly increases for the OPP costing would be after, when we get into, after the 3 years, would be 1.5%? Is that the way you estimated it?
No, actually what we did was there's several calculations. And depending on which component was calculated at the most correct number we could find. So in some cases it was 3.22%, in some cases it was 1.5, in some cases 2.15. It depended on which category it applied to.
Okay.
And if you could point out specifically.
No. I I was trying to figure out how you came up with the increases for the OPP, because even with the Shelburne Police, I know you gave them, you said in your presentation, you gave them the best scenario and the OPP the worst scenario. Am I right in that comment?
That's correct.
Okay. Even the thought process is, I know even ourselves, we try to keep it at the lowest estimate, but year after year, depending on what happens, the estimates can go up quite a bit. And it's really difficult to figure out, even with the province, in regards to it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, there's no guarantees that the numbers you worked out will be the numbers in the future regarding the OBP, any more than it will be for the Shelburne Police, depending on council. Because we have really no control over the increases to any degree for the OPP. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. What we did was we took we calculated for each year of the 10-year period the calls for service costs based on the properties within the municipality. In addition to that, we applied an increase, and I think this is the 1.5% you're talking about, an increase of 1.5% to the calls for service. Even though the overall costs for the OPP over the last couple of years, 3 years, have declined, not increased. But we didn't expect that decline would continue throughout a 10-year period, because the cost would continue going down. So we just calculated them going up. On top of that, we also took into account the recent signing of the collective agreement for the OPP, which is retroactive to the beginning of 2019, and that was 2.15%, and we applied that 2.15% across the 10-year period, including starting from 2019, to bring the base costing up in 2020. And we also put in some other minor increases in there to make sure that we weren't missing anything or calculating the cost too low. We wouldn't want to speculate, of course, as to what the costs are really going to be, but we think we've taken everything into account possible and added a bit more to it.
Okay. So is there one question per council?
No, go ahead.
Keep going. The other thing I guess I was looking for was more of a comparator, and because the OPP, what you've got there is really the base service, right? Am I correct in that thought process? It's the base, what the OPP, no enhancements, just the base service.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think, in my mind, it's a fair comparator, because I think Shelburne Police provide a little more than just the base service. There are enhancements that they are providing, and I didn't see that comparator there, I guess, in the way of the base and enhancements. And that's maybe what I was looking for. I don't know if that can be done, but I don't see it.
That was scenario B2. So if you're looking for enhancements, the enhancements for the Shelburne Police is in scenario B2.
No, I know the enhancements to the Shelburne Police. I've lived here long enough to know what they do. But what I'm trying to say is I didn't see it with the OPP, the enhancements, compared to what the Shelburne Police enhancements would be. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
There would be no enhancements with the
No,
OPP.
and that's what I'm saying. It's missing. And if we were to add those enhancements in, and a comparator to what the Shelburne Police, and that's what I'm trying to get at, what would the cost be to us? And I guess the walking through the town during the nighttime, going, like when they do the lock it or lose it, those kinds of things there, where they go through the town, where we see them bite when they go through the town, they bite. Those are or where they stop and get out of their vehicle and talk to a little child on the side of the street if something's happened. Those are the kinds of enhancements I guess I was looking for. I'm not sure I'm going to see that with the OPP. That's why I'm a little concerned.
Those are included in the costing. So with the OPP have two methods of work that they're doing. One is the proactive policing, And that's the patrols, road patrols, traffic enforcement, the things that you were talking about, school visits, all those things are included in the base cost. So there's the base cost that you see in there, and all of those things are included in the base cost. Then there is the reactive policing, and those are the calls for service. And those are the sort of thing when somebody calls 911 or calls the police, and the police have to respond to a traffic accident, to an incident, assault, or whatever it happens to be. Those are called for service costs. So they're separate, but the items that you're talking about, the services that you're talking about, are all included in the base costs, and that's outlined in the OPP proposal. In addition to that, if a municipality wanted to, if they didn't feel that that was sufficient, then a municipality could request more. But first, the Police Services Board would have a discussion with the detachment commander to ask for additional foot patrol or bicycle patrol or something of that nature. But all those things that you're talking about included in the base costing. So those are not enhancements. That's part of the base policing for the OPP.
Do we have a chart to show that? Like what, I mean, I see here that we have like numbers for the Shelburne Police Services for routine traffic stops, community services, traffic enforcement, but I don't see something similar to show me what OPP would be. So it's easy to say it's in their base model, but then will they provide, the same amount? Like in our town, we have an issue with speeding. So, when I look at routine traffic stops and I see 3,000 traffic stops, I appreciate that. Will OPP do 3,000 traffic stops, or are they only going to do 2,100? Like, I don't see that number for the OPP.
And you can compare those two numbers because one set of numbers for the Shelburne Police is based on the statistics for Shelburne over the last 3 years, actually since I think we went back to 2013 or 2014. So we have statistics for Shelburne. So that's a measurement, that's a benchmark. So if council decides to accept the OPP's proposal, that's something to discuss with the OPP and say to them, this is the standard of service that we've had. I shouldn't say standard of service, the level of service. The standard of service is essentially similar. The level of service, and we want the same sort of traffic enforcement, we want the same sort of bicycle patrols and so on. And those are the things in many, unfortunately, there's many documents within the OPP that they lay these processes out. And it's within that the Police Services Board would discuss with the detachment commander as to the level of service required.
So would that be an enhancement?
Pardon me?
Would that be an enhancement?
No.
Okay, the other question is, the per calls, were they utilized when you did a comparator? Because you have the Shelburne, you said 3 years per call, right? You have that fact. When you utilized that with the OPP, was that part of how you figured out the costing differential?
No, because the way the OPP, no, I shouldn't say that, yes, in part. Because part of it is just the base policing. That's average cost to all municipalities, to all properties throughout Ontario for whom they provide policing. So that's one part of it. The second part of that is calls for service. So what we did was we took the same as the OPP do, we took the same data and we calculated that data over a 3-year average, and then we calculated that data plus increases, plus property increases expected in the town, plus population increases expected in the town for each one of the next 10 years to calculate those calls for service costs. So that's included in there.
Included in the call?
Yes. But when we talk about enhancements might be the type of thing that I believe it's Mono does, where they pay for an additional part-time police officer to do additional traffic enforcement. And in that case, the municipality keeps the revenue from that additional traffic enforcement. But what municipalities need to do for the first few years is to work with the detachment commander, establish the level of service, and then from that level of service determine in the ensuing years, past year 3, what other enhancements they may require. And usually, as you see in mono, that not only pays for itself, but brings extra revenue into the municipality.
Anything else, Councilor Bernardo?
I'm going to let Linda go ahead.
Okay.
I've got some other questions, but
Councilor
I
Buffalo.
didn't want to hog it.
Okay, so this might be a long-winded question, but I'm looking at the option B2 where it's comparing Shelburne Police Services to the $3 million capital renovation for the town building, and looking at that versus the cost for the OPP. And looking at that in relation to starting off with, if we were to make a change to the OPP, we have to find at least $2.5 million, maybe a little bit more now because you added another $200,000 to that, to pay for something that we have nothing to show for. Just to comment on what Len's comment was, whereas spending $3 million and having a building with the police station in there, at least that money that's being spent is actually giving us an asset. So that was my first comment. Looking at those numbers, the first, second, third, and fourth year, it's costing us money. We're not making any money until maybe year 5. That's assuming that we have enough money to do anything, because with all the changes that are taking place with the province right now with regards to development charges being reduced and everything else that's hitting us, I don't even know if we're going to be able to afford to do anything, let alone consider spending this extra money. So I don't know if that's something you can answer, but that's a concern I have. So did you consider that as an asset in your everything?
I don't see it as an asset. I see it as an expenditure. And the reason is that it doesn't become an asset until you can use it, or borrow against it, or sell it. At that point, it's an asset. And then the question is there an opportunity for sale, and how much do you get for it? So it may not be an asset. You know, you could end up selling it for less than you spent on it. The $2.2 million, let's say, severance fees and OMERS and so on, those are collective agreement requirements. So it's not a matter of not getting any money for it. A negotiation was held, and that was those were the collective agreements that were settled on. So that's not just a fact.
Meaning, I'm simply making the statement that I realize that we have to pay that, but we as a community are not getting anything for that. So for a little bit more, we're getting a building or a building addition to house our police. And looking at the short term versus the 10-year term, we have no guarantee how much it's going to end up costing. This is just might be over 10 years. So my other question that relates to that is the question or the option that you have, that's the $150,000 upgrade to the existing facility. I have no idea what that means. I don't know if anybody else does, because we haven't had a conversation about it. Can you enlighten us as to what that would provide us with?
Okay, I think I have to go back and clarify your earlier comment, because I think there's something missing in there. The $3 million expenditure means at the end of 10 years, comparing that expenditure, the increases in complement to the Shelburne Police would mean that over the period of 10 years, you would be $10 million less expense by contracting with the OPP.
Yeah, I realize that.
Okay, so that's what you get for the $2.2 million expenditure. We should get $10 million over 10 years.
But if we don't have any development taking place because of all the changes to the development charges and having to upfront more costs than we had before, the possibility is quite obvious that we may not need to keep increasing it at that pace. Like, a lot of things are changing by the minute. And so my question was back to the $150,000
Okay,
renovation,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
was waiting for an
yeah.
answer on that.
And, you know, we used the best possible forecasts that are available to the town. And so we used the town's forecast to come up with that $10 million. The $150,000 is simply saying if nothing was done to the current police building, except for enough to tidy it up and spruce it up and fix any leaks in the basement that might be there, if it could be done within that amount of money, the result would be what you see at the end of 10 years under that scenario. We don't think it's a scenario that probably would be accepted, but what we did was try to provide various scenarios so that council could see a context between the models that we offered them.
So we're just going to spruce it up, and we're not going to provide maybe some more jail cells or things that are being requested by the police?
Well, as I said, you know, that's one scenario. If council decides that's not what they want to do, there are other scenarios that council can evaluate and at different costs. The important thing to note is that using the best available information we could from the city or from the town, and also from the costing scenarios from the OPP and their proposals, and doing 10-year, year-by-year forecasts, under any circumstances, the lowest cost to the town would be with the OPP. The decision that council makes, really, we're agnostic on that. We were just asked to provide objective third-party opinion, which we've done. And those are based on facts.
Okay, well, basically what I was trying to get at is, if we looked at the $150,000 option as an interim solution for the next couple of years or whatever period of time that takes to have a better understanding of what's going on in the province and where we're at, then I might feel more comfortable doing something down the road, but right now I don't. So that's, and then the other question I had relates to the 21 municipalities that you...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The other question relates to the 21 municipalities that you had asked to get feedback from, and we only got 7. So does that mean that the other 2/3 couldn't say yes or no to whether they were satisfied or dissatisfied?
I think what it says is that's the usual response you get on surveys. It's about 30%, 33%. That's pretty common in the surveys we've done across Canada. So I think there's things such as people are very busy and they don't comment, or they expect to get around to it and they don't. And when we've done other sorts of surveys in other emergency services, doesn't matter the type, we find that 30% is a pretty good response. So that's normal.
Yeah, I guess my only comment is I've gone online, as I'm sure a lot of people have, and I can pull up municipalities and issues that they've had with versus OPP versus local to OPP and back and forth. So if I can find that, I'm just curious why we weren't able to get any of that information put down in a summary.
We don't consider online as a valid
Well, they're coming from the municipalities, that information.
I'm not here to argue with the council.
Oh, I know, I'm just
saying it's
making
from an objective point of view, we don't consider online discussion as a valid thing. We find plenty of things online which support one aspect or another, not necessarily police, but other emergency services. And we find many things that object to issues in emergency services. To us, since we can't find fact behind it or we can't find evidence behind it, then we can't accept that and put that into a report. All that is to us is an opinion, and everybody's entitled to that opinion.
Okay, well, these comments, just to be clear about it, just so that there's no misunderstanding about what I'm trying to say, these were comments from staff of those municipalities or the police themselves of those municipalities or anybody who is in charge of what was going on. It was I'm not referring to personal comments that anybody may have had, just so that you
Like
understand.
newspaper articles or?
Yes.
Okay.
That's all I have to say right now.
Deputy Mayor Anderson?
Thank you. I guess when you allow several questions, you start ticking off your list or crossing off your list the questions that you want to ask. So Unfortunately, fortunately, a lot of the questions that I did have were asked by my fellow councillors. But just as a follow-up to Councillor Buffett's question about the extent of the municipalities that have participated, and there is some concern whether or not that was comprehensive enough to make a recommendation as you did. And you talked about that the numbers that you got are somewhat standard. Maybe just for the benefit of the public, when you say that you put the pitch out there to the municipalities to respond, and some of them are too busy, etc., it may be helpful to maybe clear up for those who may be wondering, is there additional follow-up? So if you make the one phone call and you leave the message and nobody responds, do you just simply leave it at that, or is there additional follow-up just to ensure you're getting the best or the most amount of participation when it comes to comparing apples to apples?
No, the way we do surveys, and I admit that when we first started doing surveys some years ago, we did exactly what you're talking about, is we kept following up until we got an answer. Sometimes the answers weren't very polite. We find that those who are willing to answer will do it fairly quickly. And we also find that keeping surveys fairly straightforward, as few as possible questions. Some can't be, done in 3 or 4 questions, but as few as possible, the better opportunity you have for response. We find that we essentially get avoided if we keep following up. We just don't get answers. So the end result is almost the same as sending out a survey, asking people to respond, and those that respond are interested in responding, and others aren't.
Okay. The other thing, again, is it may have been already blended into the questions that were asked, and certainly I think you heard from members of the public about guarantees of rates and what we could as a town rely on. Will these numbers look like what we're seeing them now, year 4, year 5 down the road? Last meeting you were here, I talked about the recent report of cutbacks to the OPP. Our CEO did a good job of explaining what that meant, but maybe you could just talk about that again as to what realistically we could be looking at, and are these numbers, as has been asked by the public, is something that we could rely upon as being quote unquote a guarantee?
Well, there's no guarantee, of course, because the numbers could change. The province could change quite frankly, the province could change the model the same as it could change the funding models and grants to municipalities. As we've seen in the last little while, those things have changed, and then the provinces backed off on some of those changes. So quite simply, there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees whether it's a municipal provision of service, not just police, but any municipal provision of service, or if it's a provincial provision of service. Are the numbers accurate? We're quite confident they are. We went into a lot of detail. Others who have done the sort of costing analysis have applied something like a 1.5% growth increase. We broke that down into segments. So I think there are 4 or 5 segments in each area, and we calculated each of those on a year-by-year basis. So we might have done a whole lot of work to come out to the same number somebody else could have by applying 1.5 or 2.5, but we're pretty confident.
Those are my messages from you. Thank you.
Okay. I'll wait till the end, so Councilor Friedman.
Okay, I guess I'll start with going into the line of questioning that Deputy Mayor was asking in regards to the survey. Can you tell us what you actually did for your surveys? What was your methodology to get your feedback?
The survey was straightforward. We wanted to know, I'm sorry, I can't think of all things right now, but we wanted to know essentially whether the service provision by the OPP was at the standard, at the level that the municipalities expected. The answers from those who responded was yes. We wanted to know if the costing was at the level they expected or higher. The answer was...
I think you misunderstand my question.
Oh.
We can see that with the results that you printed, but what exactly did you do? Did you make phone calls? Did you survey people on the streets? Was it online? What was your methodology on getting the responses?
We sent the surveys to the CAOs of the 21 municipalities, and we asked for them to respond to us. In some cases, two of the CAOs provided follow-up telephone calls, said that they would talk to us. The others didn't.
So your responses are based from CAOs, not from the actual people?
People as in the public?
As in the population?
No, we wouldn't survey the public.
In your report as well, you've gone into a fair detail on what the ministry's policing standards manual states as per what the standards should be for policing. I don't think there's anybody in this room that would state that the SPD currently provides strictly the minimum requirement based on what is stated in this. Personally, I would think that they provide a much broader service than what is required. Certainly, if we switch to OPP, would they provide us further enhancements as well? Sure, it would be speculative, but the thing that I was looking for and I was hoping for was what is the enhancements going to cost us? And I did not see anything in here that is telling us that, for example, you say the level of service such as number of hours of foot patrol, school visits beyond those normally provided by the OPP, and stringency of traffic enforcement will be negotiated between the Police Services Board and detachment commander if required. That's an enhancement, correct?
No.
The negotiation is not an enhancement?
No, it's not. So, for example, the OPP would provide, and I think the number of hours, 18 hours a week, school visits. Okay, that's within their proactive service provision.
18 hours?
Yeah. Okay. So, if the Police Services Board felt that 20 hours was better, then the Police Services Board would negotiate that with the detachment commander and see if that was possible.
And if it wasn't?
And if it wasn't, the Police Services Board would then have to decide whether there should be a 2-hour per week enhancement.
So
or 20 hour, or 40, or whatever it happens. Same with foot patrol and so on.
So my question then is, what's the cost of that enhancement?
Well,
this is the question that we put to the OPP as well. We asked them, we need to know what is it going to cost for over and above what is the basic. If we go through our 3-year and we find that the basic is not sufficient and we do need to go into the enhancements, if we don't know what the costs to enhance the services that we are getting are, how do we make a proper decision?
I think the difficulty here is that there are no enhancements at the beginning.
Not at the beginning.
And you don't know if there's going to be speculative to think about what enhancements might be in year 4. And the reason is that in the first 3 years, the OPP are providing exactly the same staffing as you currently have. So if it's 15 let's just round it off, 15 officers, there'll be 15 officers. And the next question, of course, that always comes up is there a guarantee that many, or 3 or whatever, will always be in the town? As much of a guarantee as there is with the Shelburne Police right now, since they assist each other.
Sure.
Go in and out of the town and assist each other. So for the 3-year transition period, and that's why it's a transition period, then you're receiving the same policing as you have now. Same numbers of police, probably the same shift pattern. In all likelihood, probably the same police, same bodies, okay? That's the transition period. During that transition period, what happens, and this is not abnormal in any transition period in any sort of organization, the OPP gather more statistics and data as to what's going on in the municipality so that they can determine what they need to do in ensuing years. That gives them that opportunity. If for some reason the Police Services Board feels that the service isn't at the same level in those 3 years, they can have that discussion with the detachment commander. But there's no reason to think that it wouldn't be at the same level because it's the same number of staff, probably the same shift pattern, probably generally the same people. So all things would be the same. If in year 4, there's a thought that enhancements are necessary for one reason or another, the first thing to do is discuss that with the detachment commander, the same as the police services board, discuss it with the chief of police, and see if there are some things that can be done to augment the service being provided without getting into additional costs. It's only at that point that if there was no alternatives whatsoever, and there was a thought that you need additional traffic control, additional time at the schools, foot patrol, whatever it may be, then only would it be time to talk about enhancements and the costs of those enhancements. Highly, highly unlikely though.
I only really have one other question, and that's in regards to the schools. You've also got your report where you're saying that you have one officer who is the typical liaison within the schools. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Currently, I know for a fact that we have 2 to 3 officers. I don't know if any of my colleagues can confirm that. There's at least 2, maybe 3 officers currently that interact with our students on a regular basis and build a relationship with the kids. Part of my worry being if it goes down to one officer, we don't have that same respect for the uniform, seeing that interaction with multiple officers that gives those kids a sense of ease with the police.
Yeah.
So that is one of my concerns. So I just wanted to confirm that it is, with OPP, it is only one officer who's going to be the liaison.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I don't have reports, but and I'm not sure the reports on school liaison would be applicable in this case, because most of the reports you find are from the U.S. and they talk about intercity and various things like that. This isn't the same demographic and applicable model. The reports do indicate that as opposed to multiple officers, the relationship building with a particular officer is quite successful. We didn't include that because I don't think it's factual to Shelburne. That again, if you look at other municipalities, they usually assign an officer to community liaison, school visits, and so on. If you think that that should be changed, I mean, I'm sure that's something you talk to the detachment commander about, or perhaps, you know, officers on patrol even stop in. All I can do is tell you from the community services statistics, 2016, 2017, 2018. 2018 had 899 community services, which they noted here as school visits and foot patrol. I'm not sure what the split is, could be all school visits. And over that period, if you look at the numbers, it's about 151 hours of time spent doing that over the school year. So, you know, that's not substantial time each day, but it is, as they tell us, as the police tell us, is they visit at lunch times and so on. And that's pretty well in effect, because you figure about 45 minutes of lunchtime is visits and so on. That would be about the right statistics. So we would assume there might be a change with the OPP. It may be an officer that's going to visit once or twice a week for 2 hours or 3 hours rather than 45 minutes some days. And according to this statistics, those visits weren't daily visits. There's about 200 days in the school year, so it happens. That again is quite understandable.
So just for clarification, those 150 hours you're referencing, that's under Shelburne Police Service?
Shelburne Police Service.
Okay. Councillor Hall?
So again, getting into the numbers, when I look at your OPP costing, when you go into year 4, it shows a $1.2 million drop.
Yeah.
So what's the base assumption as far as how many officers are you showing that OPP are going to be showing based on that base assumption?
Probably the same. The difference is it's a different funding model in year 4 than it is in the first 3 years.
So, and I understand that, and you referenced Mono earlier in your comments. So to have an understanding, again, based on factual data, Mono pays about 1.2 million for 8 officers in their business years, in their fiscal years. So I'm kind of curious as how we can carry 18 officers at 1.7 million versus Mono that's at 1.2.
The calculations were done based on the calls for service and base service, and it's the same calculations as the OPP are using. Give me a second just to look at it. And which model?
Well,
You're talking
Mono
about
is
the cost of model?
I'm talking about current actual budget cost for Mono sits at 1.2 million. And they've got 8 officers assigned to them. So when I do the math, it tells me that we're going to drop to 60% of where we are right now. Maybe 12 officers versus the current 18. Somebody has to pay that difference.
1.75 million in 2023. Is that the number you're talking about?
I'm talking about your 1.692 in 23.
Okay, 1.692, that includes the revenue adjustments. Yeah, I would have to go through those with you on a line-by-line basis, but that's based on the provincial average cost per service plus the calls for service, which is an additional charge. So the difference in there might be in that calls for service between Mono and this location. I'm not sure they're equally comparable though, but
It's just difficult being from a business perspective and you see a $1.2 million drop. The only place that 1.2 million can be found is under labor. It doesn't come from anywhere else. So it would lead me to believe that there has to be a reduction in overall officers. So when you talk about standard of service, I don't disagree that standard of service versus Shelburne versus OPP is no different, but my concern really becomes police coverage. So who's now covering the town if we're now looking at a 1.2 million drop?
yeah, I understand what you mean. The service provision isn't based solely on the town cost, because a lot of that's average across the province. And if the municipality doesn't have a high level of calls for service, there are other municipalities, if you look at them in the province, have a very high level of calls for service based on a per capita basis because of social issues and whatever it might be. Their costs are much, much higher.
But I would assume in that same instance, if you don't have the calls for service, then you don't have the need for the police, so they move them. They're not going to continue to carry that additional the province isn't going to carry the 1.2 million just because we wanted 18 officers to begin with. It's going to drop in accordance to their budgets as well. If the calls of service decrease, then obviously the officers aren't seen as needed.
Yeah, part of the zone model is that where the incidents are is where the officers are. So when you look at this general area, where the incidents are would be mostly in Shelburne, and that's where you find the officers for most of the case. So I can't tell you whether that's a drop of 7 officers or whatever it happens to be, but I would very much doubt that you would see a drop in officers in the staffing levels.
I guess the taxpayers got to pay the same money, so whether it's provincial or otherwise, that 1.2 million has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, a lot of it is averaged out across the province, and that's exactly what happens. You get an averaging across the province, and there's some benefits to it.
The other concern that I have is if that's the case, if it is becoming some form of police coverage, obviously we're in the middle of a population growth, continuing with the multiple locations with regards to residential builds, commercial builds, etc. So our population is increasing, and yet I don't see the reflection of that in here. I know that, for example, our police services uses an officer per population ratio. So I know that that's not necessarily the ideal situation, but when I look at the numbers, I don't see something that offsets the growth that we're expecting. You know, if we're expected to go to 12,000 residents, I don't see the costing for that reflective in the OPP side where, you know, I know, again, the chief put through some increases based on, again, probably that officer per population scenario, but I don't see that in any of the OPP costing side.
Yeah, it's definitely in there. We didn't do it on a cop to pop or pop to cop, whatever the terminology is. And the reason being is that you could have a population which has very little calls for service, very few calls for service based on the population. So what we did was we took the calls per service ratio over the last 4 years, 2014 to 25 years, 2014 to 2018, and we looked at the changes in those calls for service and the type of calls for service. Unfortunately, it was one of the things I wanted to show you last week and wasn't able to show you. If you'd like to, I can certainly show you another time. And we calculated all those out on a calls per service basis and projected that over the 10-year period. So we did that for every one of the 10 years to come up with the number of incidents that are probable based on the history of incidents in Shelburne. So instead of a cop to population, we did it on service level requirements, and which we think is fairly high. Not fairly high, it's very high. And it's in there, you're pleased to show.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand based on the summary of the numbers without having or seeing the base data that goes behind it.
So can I ask a question follow up on Shane's question? You said that it's per calls per service and mono may be the reason for that costing to them. But mono's mainly rural. There's a very small section of it in the south end that's urban. We are fairly urban and large urban. And again, I guess I go back to the question that was asked. I know you got the calls for service or whatever for 40 years, but in the urban and with the growth, the calls for service would just naturally go up, and there should be a greater cost to Shelburne, which is urban, as compared to Mona, which is rural. Like, I'm not getting it. I follow the same business model as Shannon is following. I just don't get it. I'm having a difficult time. And you know, as I said, be pleased to take you through those calculations. Population doesn't mean corresponding calls for service. It's based on the history of what's happened in Shelburne and projecting that for each of the 10 years forward. So it's on a per capita basis, it's done on the percentage increases, and it's a very accurate way of indicating what your calls for service are going to be. And then the cost for calls for service are based on that. So I guess the rural has had an awful time out there with calls for service because they seem to be paying more. Again, that's my difficulty with it. I agree with him in the business model, I guess. I'm just having a really difficult time.
I think intuitively it's very hard to follow. It's not, just because intuitively it's hard to follow doesn't mean it's inaccurate though.
Councillor Hall, anything further? Could you just maybe move the mic down for Councillor Wagner there?
So I guess for me, you kind of already answered my question about traffic and whatnot, because as a resident in this town, I know that that's one of my major concerns as well. Everyone has pretty much, since I'm last, answered some of the issues and concerns that I had. So I guess just for clarification for our community, it looks like the savings per month per household on the low end would be $17 and on the high end about $26. Is that correct?
I'll have to accept what you say. We didn't calculate it on a monthly basis, we did it yearly.
All right, I'm just making sure I have mine,
Yeah.
because, you know, numbers, right? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
All right. So I'll start where you did in terms of your presentation last week, and that is with the conclusion. So essentially you concluded that after you completed your analysis, Shelburne should expect the same level and quality of service that we've grown accustomed to with the Shelburne Police Service with the OPP, but at a much lower cost. On the financial side, I mean, I get it. We sort of bantied around, you know, a couple of concepts tonight. There were a few assumptions made, I think, in those calculations, and that'll lead to one of my later questions. So on the financial side, I'm comfortable with that. I guess my question and what I'm struggling with a little bit is how are you able to arrive at the conclusion that in terms of quality and level of service, we would have the same experience with OPP as what we're experiencing now with Shelburne Police Service? What sort of informed your analysis to allow you to reach that conclusion on the operational side?
Yeah. So there's two parts to that. There's quality of service and there's level of service. So from a quality service point of view, police services in the province are all have the same, police officers all have the same level of training, they all abide by the same act and regulations, and there's provincial oversight of all of them. So it's very difficult for anybody to say a police service is better than another police service or vice versa. So that's quality of service. It's because of legislation. It's not the type of situation where a county or a municipality decides on the quality of service that they're going to have, whether officers are chosen in a certain way or hired in a certain way, or they work under bylaw as opposed to working under a provincial mandate and provincial regulation. The level of service is something different, and that's what I think most people talk about when they talk about policing. They want to see the level of service in Shelburne continue. So that may mean certain. That's not me, is it? No. Okay. They would want to see, for example, the number of school visits, the traffic enforcement levels, those sort of things. So from a level of service point of view, in the first 3 years, through the transition years, those are the years where those discussions take place and those service levels are set out by the Police Services Board with the detachment commander. And that establishes the level of service that you want in the municipality that you're paying for. Okay? That has to continue in years 4 through whatever it happens to be, if that's the decision that council makes. And that's, in the first 3 years, that's where you set those expectations, those levels, and that's where it continues on thereafter. So that's why we stated that from the point of view of service and level of service, it would be essentially the same. You have control over that.
Okay, so then as sort of a corollary of that, and I know we've sort of talked about this a little bit tonight, based on your experience and your analysis, the level of service that we are used to here currently under the Shelburne Police Service, in your opinion, could be maintained under the OPP as part of their base level of service without enhancements?
That's their proactive level of service, their base level of service. There are very few categories of reactive service. And those are when people call for help. So if you look at the statistics associated with the Shelburne Police, just to give you some examples. So things like routine traffic stops, community service, traffic enforcement, those sort of things are all within the base level of service. They're proactive. When you get into things like noise complaints, thefts, motor vehicle collisions, domestic disputes, unwanted person, those are reactive. And when you, even in the charts that's provided in the back of the report, when you look at those those incidents and the number of incidents per year, they're fortunately quite low. Not saying they don't exist, not saying they need to be ignored, just they're fortunately quite low. The municipality pays for those reactive incidents, and they're relatively low. So that's the basis that we made the recommendation.
Okay. So in terms of your study work, that led to the analysis, what sort of background materials did you go through, both on the Shelburne Police Service side and the OPP side, to allow you to reach the conclusion that you reached?
The statistics are only on the Shelburne Police side because there's no statistics from the OPP for the Shelburne. So what we would have to do is take statistics for the OPP for another municipality, and if you look at comparators and exemplars and doing comparators, it's very difficult to find an accurate peer review where something is the same in the square kilometers, the population, the demographic, growth, etc. So you wouldn't want to rely on that because that wouldn't be accurate, wouldn't be factual. So what we then do is take a look at the statistics, because those are accurate, as accurate as possible, for Shelburne, and then look at how that would apply to the OPP from the point of view of would the OPP be able to provide the same level of service. And there's nothing to indicate that they wouldn't be able to provide the same level of service. No indicators whatsoever.
I think one of the concerns that members of the community have, and I think fair to say all of us up here have, are some of those intangibles that were currently being provided from the Shelburne Police Service, but to which we've grown accustomed. And I get it that those things are difficult to quantify in some sort of formal analysis. But I mean, was there any credence given to those sorts of things at all? In terms of community involvement and sort of the unique aspects of a hometown local force.
What do you mean by credence given to those things?
What was that part of the analysis in terms of looking at levels of service?
Let me try this answer because it's a difficult question to answer. On one hand, we attended public meetings and we listened to what the public had to say and the concerns that they offered. We didn't listen to that from the perspective of what does the town want? What have we heard the town wants? And had that come into our evaluation. We listened to it from the perspective of, is there something that people are saying that would cause us to go and look at something factual? Should we investigate something? So, and I don't recall that there was anything like that, but had there been, then we would have looked at it from that point of view. So on the one hand, we do listen to what people have to say. On the other hand, what we're asked for is a costing analysis based on fact where we can back it up with evidence. So if somebody asks us a question, we can say, yeah, let's go through this and we'll show you exactly how we came to this answer. So I hope that answers the question without,
One of the other concerns that I think all of us have heard time and time again is with respect to response times. And I know that your report sort of addresses that within the context of zone policing. Can you sort of walk us through again the whole concept of zone policing? Because personally, I'm not sure I've completely wrapped my head around that concept, but can you sort of walk us through that again, and then how response times would be affected by that kind of model, because it's obviously different from what we're used to now.
So zone policing really is deciding. I can equate it to ambulance easier because that's what everybody's been used to for the last 30 years or so. So there's an ambulance station in Shelburne, there's an ambulance station in Orangeville. I'm not really familiar with the area where the ambulance stations are. Those are in zones. And it's based on incidents, time on task, how long it takes to go through an incident process. Exactly the same thing as part of the costing process that the OPP do. This is all time on task. And then a decision is made as to what level of resources are required in the zone. Is it 2 ambulances, 3 police cars, 4 ambulances, those type of things. Those are under normal circumstances. Where the zone part comes in, so normally you would have, let's say, 2 ambulances in Shelburne. Unless there's a circumstance where one ambulance has to leave or they have to move to another area, and then there's a backup process where other ambulances are moved in to cover off the zones. The police zone would operate on the same basis, so under normal circumstances there would be a certain number of police officers in Shelburne, a certain number in Mono and other locations in the zones around here. Quite clearly, if there was an incident that happened outside of Shelburne and the closest police officers were in Shelburne, then those police officers would be sent to that. It wouldn't be the type of situation right now, as is now, where an OPP officer from another location might be sent to an incident on the outskirts of Shelburne, rather than asking the Shelburne police to respond, even though that does happen from time to time. When that occurs, then a decision is made depending on the frequency of incidents, the time of day, various things like that, as to whether police cars from other areas should be brought into Shelburne to back up, or close to Shelburne to back up. Or what would really happen is that some of those things, like the proactive policing for traffic enforcement and so on, might be put in abeyance for an hour or so while those really important incidents are taken care of. So that's zone policing. It works in the zone. Under normal circumstances, everybody's at home, so to speak, at their station or at their patrol area. And they aren't then pulled out of one zone because it's quiet. Well, why don't you go patrol another zone? I mean, there's possibility that depending on the circumstances, those things may happen from time to time. It's the same possibility right now that Shelburne might be asked to assist the OPP, or the OPP might ask Shelburne to assist with the breath analysis or breathalyzer or something like that. It's because some of those resources are shared.
Okay. So under that model, under normal circumstances, then, as I understand it, there would be a dedicated number of officers within our zone, unless something happens elsewhere that they get called out.
The only correction I can make there is don't use the word dedicated. Okay. Dedicated sounds like you'll never leave.
Okay.
It's
assigned.
Assigned.
Okay.
Assigned
Stations.
yeah.
Okay. What happens if, from a detachment-wide perspective, if there are low numbers that report to work on a particular day for all of Dufferin County? What happens to that model? It seems to me that the zone model, in order to work, sort of relies on the fact that everybody's going to show up to work and is scheduled to be there that day. So what happens, in the event that 3 or 4 officers call in sick?
In all likelihood, it's overtime, and it would be the same thing if 2 officers happen to be sick at the same time as Shelburne on a shift. Then we assume that other people might be called in on overtime. So it would be the same sort of thing. There could be the circumstance, as the chief will tell you, where occasionally there's 2 officers rather than 3 on duty in Shelburne. It's rare, as he says, but it's a possibility. And I'm sure the same thing might happen in zone policing, that there might be rare occasions where it'd be fewer than that. Those are the things that the control with the Police Services Board has to be maintained, so that you can be sure that those things don't happen too frequently. Expectations have to be laid out.
Okay. On the costing side, then, and again, I know we've sort of been around this, but it's important to make sure we understand this completely. In years 1 to 3 under the transitional contract, that's pretty predictable, right? Because we're essentially paying for, as I understand it, at least the full-time equivalent of the full complement of officers that we currently have.
Correct.
after year 3, that's when we move into the OPP billing model, which is based upon sort of the provincial, or our share of the provincial average base cost plus calls for service. Is that
Plus calls for service.
okay? So in your calculations then, under any one of the 7 scenarios, when you were calculating those annual costs on the OPP side of the ledger, how did you reach those conclusions?
How did we reach the costs?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's 2 parts to that. If we're talking about year 4 on.
Year 4 on. Yeah.
There's 2 parts to that. The first is the standard cost for base policing at every municipality in Ontario that is receiving OPP policing pays. And that's, I think it's $289 or something like that. I can't remember exactly. That's
Per
the
household?
one per property.
Per property, right?
Yeah. That's the one that is applied across the province. That's the one that's average. The second part to that are calls for service. And so that is particular to each municipality. So some municipalities may have a high volume of calls for service, some may have a low volume. And if calls for service, the easiest way to remember that is if somebody picks up a phone and calls 911 and reports something that the police have to investigate, that's a call for service. And on that, a municipality pays for each of those calls for service, again based on the property in the municipality on average, and it's calculated over that period of the year. Okay? In addition to that, each year there's rationalization of additional things like overtime required because of incidents, calls for service incidents. Not because somebody didn't report on duty and so they had to call somebody in on overtime. That's in the base costing. But particular to the community for extra costs that weren't expected and aren't within calls for service. There's also provision in there for guards, there's provision in there for equipment, and there's 5 or 6 areas that get taken into account as well. Those were included in the calculations. Plus, we put in an additional percentage for growth, because when the OPP do their proposal and then the costing analysis is based on 3 years of data, 3 years of statistics, 4 years later. So in other words, 2018 isn't taken into account in the 2019 base costing.
Okay. In terms of the severance considerations then, so you made a brief update tonight, the additional, was it $230,000?
203.
203.
Yeah.
So what's the total severance cost then that would be incurred by the town if we did accept the OPP proposal?
And wait, was that just strictly police, or was there also staff, the other part of staff involved in that?
The total severance, and these are all contractual obligations, is $2.36 million, $2,360,000.
As well as civilian staff?
Correct.
Is there any additional information that you can provide on that? I mean, just, that seems like a big number to me. I mean, in your experience in other communities where you've done this kind of work, is that sort of in line with a service this size?
It again depends, and we're really careful here because, we don't want to talk about any personal information, but in sort of in group categories, there are things like years of service. and then there's a payout based on years of service. There's a severance requirement within the agreements related to if the OPP becomes the police service providing policing. There's OMERS top-up, again, in case of the OPP providing policing. And the OMERS top-up just is to set up the difference between the public service pension plan and the OMERS pension plan, which is richer than the public service pension plan. There are payouts for accumulated sick time. There are payouts for sick days credit. And there are payouts for a week of severance for each year of employment, in addition to the others, which brings it up to that amount of $2.36 million. And yes, that's for all staff members, including civilian.
And those severance payments, correct me if I'm wrong, but those severance payments would be payable to all of the officers, employees, chief, regardless of whether or not they're hired by OPP?
That's correct.
So that's a fixed cost that is just built in there. I mean, that's not going to change.
That's correct. It's a negotiated amount.
All right, just one last question, and then I'll open it back up, and if any of my colleagues have any other follow-ups, we can do that. In your experience, I mean, are there any municipalities that you've worked with that have gone through a similar costing process like this, decided at the end of the day to stay put, to retain their own municipal force, but as part of that, undertook some sort of operational review to see if there are any ways to find, efficiencies within the service they have, instead of going to the OPP to find those savings?
I'm not aware of any. Doesn't mean there haven't been any. I'm not aware of them.
Okay. Is that something that might be worthwhile looking at, though, if this council decides to reject the OPP proposal and stay with the municipal force?
So here's where problems come in. And if the chief's in here or any officers, I apologize. I don't mean this in any detrimental way. You have more officers than you need based on calls for service. All the rest of it is proactive policing. If you were staffing based on calls for service, you would have about 7.5 officers.
Sorry,
7.5 rather than 50, okay? Plus civilian staff.
Based just on calls for service.
Calls for service, okay? Those are the reactive calls for service. And here's where the problems with that kind of analysis come in. You send an officer, in some shifts, it's so quiet that one officer might be sufficient based on calls for service. It wouldn't be traffic enforcement or anything like that. Traffic enforcement would take place when the officer didn't have other calls to go on. If an incident came up that an officer had to respond, and it was a domestic dispute, if it was any kind of possible violence, there's no backup. And so right away that officer is in danger. So then you have to get the backup from the OPP, some other police force, and wait for that backup to come. And so what occurs in that case then is that a reasonable community would say you can't leave your officers in that kind of environment. You have to hire more officers to address the issue. And you would probably end up with 15 sub-officers because of number of calls, proper backup, time off for education, other training, illnesses, vacation, all those things. You'd probably end up at the same level. Where there are some opportunities, I would assume, and we haven't talked to the OPP about this, the OPP, is that backups available in other locations as well, and that's where you get the averaging. And I don't think it necessarily means a reduction in the number of officers assigned to Shelburne, but I think what it would be is that there would be the possibility that on zone policing, this is where zone policing comes into play, there's backup available in other locations from other locations, plus Shelburne could offer backup to an officer in Mono if necessary, and if things are quiet in Shelburne. That's where zone policing comes in. That's where a lot of people
And I guess that goes maybe to
That's
Councilor
exactly
Hall's point, yeah, okay. Okay, the point that just kind of went off there. a little bit.
I think the other point I want to make though is it doesn't, right away people say, well, what if something happens and they're assisting somebody else? These decisions aren't based on how are things going tonight. They're based on statistical analysis over a long term. This is the way emergency services do this kind of analysis, statistically over a long term, and determine what the possibility of incidents are before they make those sort of decisions. In fact, I'm not suggesting the OPP use it, but there are other emergency services that use predictive analysis tools to determine what sort of response they require at certain times. So it's a very common thing.
Okay, that's it for me. Anybody else have any follow-up questions?
Sure, I've been writing down here. So I just sort of follow back a little bit. If we go with the OPP, and we've seen downloads quite often from the province, there's no guarantee that somewhere down the road we couldn't be downloaded additional costs from the province. There's no guarantee on what the province will do, and we have no control over that. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement no matter which side of the ledger you're on. I mean, municipally, as you've seen, there's downloading of costs from the province.
Yeah, I know there's...
And you're quite right. Nobody can forecast what's going to happen with the OPP. Is it going to be $10 million worth of, or $4 million worth of downloading?
We don't know.
Speculative.
But right now, we do have control somewhat over our police budgets. The budgets do come to us, and we can reject them and send them back and say, lower, we're not going to accept that budget the way it is. With the OPP and downloading, we have no control, is what I'm trying to say, I guess, as a fair statement. And you're right, we do get downloaded from the province, but in other ways.
That's a fair statement, but the other thing that you have to recall is that, or remember, is that Shelburne or wherever else it might be, Midland, wherever it might be, wouldn't be getting those downloads by themselves. Those downloads would have to be done province-wide. And then from an association of municipalities point of view, perhaps you could do something about it. But you're absolutely right. There's no guarantee, and to speculate on those type of things just wouldn't be possible.
Unfortunately, in my years of experience, I have to speculate on those things. What was the other questions I had? On OPP officers, when you were talking about zone, and the ambulance is the model somewhat you based or sort of similar to, right? The ambulances are zoned currently right now.
That's right.
I know that in some cases the movement of ambulances around creates some issues from time to time with the zone model. And I'm just, with the policing model, we heard it from the police that if things got moved out of the zone, they would go to Great County to bring in, because that's part of the zone model, I guess, or whatever, integrated model, they called it something, I can't remember what it was, or Nottawasaga. 20 minutes, time factor, at least, minimal.
Yeah, it's not done that way. The integrated model is province-wide, and as I said in the report, ambulances had that for, since the 1970s, whatever that's been. It's done on the basis of, you don't wait for that next call to come in and then send somebody from Mount-Wasaga or Bray County. It's a coverage pattern. And so if things are very busy in one area or another, there might be some movement of cars from a quieter area to a midway point, to patrol midway point, or getting closer to those areas for backup. Though that's the integrated model. It's the same thing in ambulance. It's a matter of predicting what might happen next and relocating resources to make sure that that's covered off.
Okay, anything else?
Sure, I have a quick question. It's actually a follow-up to some of the mayor's questions, particularly as he focused on, at least in part, on the level of service. You also heard from Councillor Fegan when he talked about relationship building by our police and that potentially being lost. I wanted to pick up on something that you said during the Q&A, I guess, and you said same bodies. And
I'm sorry,
I think you used the word same bodies, and I'll put it into context. Is with the concern of loss of relationships potentially, if you could speak to, or maybe elaborate more on your reference to same bodies, or maybe I could put it this way, based on your experience, how often, well, based on your experience, is there a realistic possibility that some of these same officers that we have here in Shelburne, if we go with the OPP, will be absorbed within the police force in providing the same level of service that we've grown accustomed to?
Yeah, it's a good question because there's a couple of things here. First of all, the likelihood is that the officers who, assuming council makes this decision, the officers that are here move to the OPP, they will likely be assigned back to their own area. And part of the reason for that is, as the detachment commander said, is because they know the area, they like it, and so on. They might request to go to another area. They might request to be moved around, and any officer can do that. And as the staff sergeant said, they accommodate that as much as possible. So the probability is that the officers who currently patrol, if it were an OPP scenario, would probably be doing the same thing in the same town. The other thing that I think has to be kept in mind is that staff do change. So over the period of 10 years, likely some of those police officers in an OPP model that are here, that would be here now, would want to be transferred somewhere else, so they might retire. Changes in personnel happen. But it's the same thing with your current police service, because when I look at this and I count the number of years people have been here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8 that have been here less than 6 years. 2 have been here for less than 2 years. I won't go into the rest of this, but changes happen just as they're happening within your police force, the current police force. I think under most circumstances, I shouldn't say I think, because what I'm saying is that there's no evidence that anything looks any different than what you're currently experiencing. Not to say, as you've noted, there are no guarantees in anything. So staff changes will happen.
Anything else?
Well, just a comment. You said some of them have only been 2 years or so, but we have a tendency to hire from the, we have a tendency to hire officers from those that are, what do you call the volunteers? Auxiliary officers.
Yes.
And necessarily doesn't mean that they're coming from out of town and being hired in here. They could be local people that have been auxiliary and been in town for quite a while.
That's
So that's just something. I'm not sure the OPP, we'd get the same result. We may get new people coming in. So there may be a little bit of a difference there.
Yes, and I understand that, because, looking at here, the start date as a constable, the start date with Shelburne Police Service, the dates are different. We've taken this from, in most of these calculations, to start date with the Shelburne Police Service when we've done the calculations. So, yeah, absolutely. There are different practices.
Okay. One last call. No more questions? Okay. Thank you, John. Safe trip home.